Again, let me express my appreciation to the Foundation, Vicente, Carlota, and also my colleague, Emilio, and my other colleague, Mercedes, for inviting me and my wife here to visit Madrid. So we are going back to the classroom for a little bit, and I am going to talk about the work I've been doing on platforms. And just to give a little background, I really started studying this subject in the early 1990s and have written 4 or 5 books on this subject. And it's become just an explosion of technology and government policy and entrepreneurship all coming together. So I will try to give some insights into that research, talking about platforms in the future and the opportunities for innovation and also entrepreneurship. I am always usually introducing a book. My co-authors and I put this book together in 2019, came out by Harper Business, and I'll introduce some of the key themes. We call it the business of platforms. But the work really started with a book I wrote in 1991 called Japan's Software Factories, and then a book 1995 called Microsoft Secrets, which is about what we call innovation platforms, then a book 2002 called Platform Leadership with Annabelle Gower, previous book 1998 Competing on Internet Time with my other co-author David Yaffe, and then a series of other books. So we're really trying to bring together 25 to 30 years almost of thinking about platforms. So I'll introduce a few of our ideas on platform thinking. We have another framework for trying to predict if a market is going to end up with one big winner. We call it the winner-take-all or most framework. I'm not going to talk about that today. I am going to give a few comments on strategy and business models and also some of the double-edged sword issues, the pluses and minuses that come along with platforms. And then we'll focus on some of the newer platforms that are coming. And those all involve lots of opportunities for entrepreneurs, but also many questions about regulation and government policy. So it's a lot to cover, but we'll just give you a quick flavor of some of these critical issues. I should also keep track of time, because I can easily talk about this all day. So the first point to make is that platforms are everywhere. And we pretty much talk about high technology these days in terms of different types of platforms, whether it's, again, computers, where I began, or smartphones, social media, video games, enterprise software, microprocessors, underlying software, even power systems, electric vehicles, or fuel cells, sharing economy applications, messaging, payments, Internet of Things, web services. Almost everything now is organized around platforms of different types. One of the issues for Europe is that many of the leading companies around these platforms are actually from America, the United States, or China. And many other countries are left figuring out their place in this complicated world. And there's another long history to why that occurred. But it really should be a wake-up call to universities and governments around the world that they need to be more concerned with how technology is being organized today. The other point about platforms is many of them work together. They don't work in isolation. The internet is a platform, for example, sitting on top of other platforms like personal computers or smartphones. And those are also sitting on top of another platform, which is the telephone system in many ways. And then we have different layers of platforms. So platforms on top of each other or working alongside each other is really how the modern world of technology has been organized. So this is an issue for not only us as individuals, but certainly governments and companies and investors. We end up speaking a lot with investors because the platform companies have become the first trillion-dollar truly private corporations. And of course, everyone is familiar with companies like Apple, Microsoft, and Alphabet, Amazon. Alphabet is really Google. So These companies are everywhere. They're extraordinarily powerful. They're becoming more and more powerful as each day goes by. So understanding how they work and how we can create new generations of these companies is also very important for all of us. Now, one of the things that my co-authors and I have done, and again, I should introduce David Yaffe, my co-author from Harvard Business School. And again, we've been working together since the 1990s. And then Annabelle Gower, who was my PhD student at MIT Sloan. We've also been writing together for about 20 years. She's at University of Surrey and also a visiting professor at Oxford. We spent several years putting this book together and have tried to define a number of concepts, particularly ones that Annabelle and I started developing in the early 2000s. So we have distinguished an industry platform from company platforms, and I'll say a few more words about that. But an industry platform is a foundation. It's often consisting of reusable components or different types of services that many different companies can access to build their own products or their own services. So it's, again, this bottom layer or product that becomes this center of what we now call an ecosystem. And companies produce what we also call complementary products and services. And so it is this center of this universe or ecosystem. And there's also another phenomenon that has now become commonplace words, but in the beginning it was a concept we didn't understand very well. And we call that network effects. So actually the more users you have of a particular platform or product, depends on the type of technology we're talking about, or the more complementary innovations, then that platform becomes increasingly valuable with each additional user or complement. So that creates this potential for exponential growth, or at least geometric growth, rather than traditional linear types of growth models. And the network effects, of course, are these positive feedback loops that are self-reinforcing. So this has become a whole different way of thinking about products and markets and economic growth. The critical point about platforms is that they enable these types of network effects and this type of connection of people or goods and services around the world. Now, we used to use the term platform long before we thought about network effects. Although actually, and again, I promise not to do too many diversions, but the concept of network effects actually goes back to the early 1900s and AT&T developing the telephone system. Because that was essentially a network. And the more people that had telephones, of course, the more valuable the telephone became. And that is essentially a one-sided network effect. Modern platforms bring in multiple players to that network. But we also use the term platform very, very commonly in technology management or operations, particularly in industries like the automobile industry, where a company would make an underbody, a set of reusable modules that many different engineering groups could use to build a series or a family of products. Like Toyota has a front-wheel drive platform, essentially. It builds 5 distinct vehicles on it, an SUV, a sports car, a Corolla sedan, a luxury car. So that concept of reusable components that multiple groups can use was very common in engineering, but restricted to the firm. What happened largely in the 1990s, we began using the term platform in a sense of opening up those modules or those capabilities to third-party firms, not in a supplier context, which is controlled by contracts, but really open innovation in a sense that making various modules accessible for third parties to independently do their own innovation or invention. And that's what we call this concept of an industry platform, a loosely organized network of customers, of course, but complementers and partners in other ways. But it's a different model of innovation, as I can see as you can see in the graph there. It's this nebulous network, and it's much, much larger. Can involve millions or even billions of users, and of course thousands and even millions of companies. So again, we're familiar with this now, but I will just use one quick illustration. So the iPhone, for example, is always a wonderful product. It has many features and applications bundled into it. But one feature that is really a result of it being a platform is this. So when the iPhone was built as a product, a camera was built into it with a flash, but the flash was made in a modular way, and there was a separate entrepreneur who one day said, well, why can't I write a little piece of code, send a message to the flash to go on and stay on? And then you have a flashlight in your iPhone. But this is not something that Steve Jobs and his team ever thought of. This is a very expensive flashlight, by the way. But it's what made this a platform and not just a product. It is also a very good product, which is a way to get a platform started. Have a very good product that has openings for other types of innovations that third parties can think of. Apple would never have thought of that. So now there's a couple million of those types of things available for the iPhone through an app store, some of which Apple built, but most of which are built by other people. So this type of platform has things in common to other platforms, which I'll get to in a moment, but the most important features of platforms are really three, and we'll list them out here. Is one, a platform, rather than within a company, but an industry-level platform, is bringing together two or more market participants of different types. In the case of the iPhone, it's bringing together creators of these different applications with users of those applications, and the platform is the intermediary in the center. So that's the first one. And as these different sides come together, they create the second point. They create network effects. They can either be direct, user to user, like in Facebook or a telephone, or they can be indirect, like a user to an advertiser, or even a user to an innovator. We call those direct or same-side network effects versus indirect or cross-side network effects. They can be extremely powerful, but the value of the platform comes from the network effects. There's also value in the standalone product, but that special value comes from the connection to the network, both in the ability to get more innovations than you would otherwise get, as well as to create more types of connections than you would otherwise create. And the connections leads us to a different type of platform, which I'll talk about in a moment. The third problem that is unique among platform companies is they have to solve what we call a chicken or egg problem. They have to get started. How do you create that value and get started when it's usually the case that the value only comes about when two sides exist or are populated? So you have this problem where if you're just creating your product and selling it, Apple can design an iPhone and just sell it. But if the value of the iPhone depended on bringing together producers of innovations with users, you have to get started somehow. So it's obvious you solve the chicken or egg problem in that sense by a product strategy. Essentially, you create standalone value for one side first, the user, for example, and then you open it up for a second side to come in. So this is an old type of problem. Credit cards have the problem. Railroads have this problem. The Yellow Pages have this problem. There's different ways of solving it. But all industry platforms have to solve this more complex business model, which I like to say it's like playing three-dimensional chess if you're a Star Trek fan. You're balancing multiple sides of a market at the same time. The other major, I'd say, contribution of our research, myself, Annabelle Gower, and David Yaffe, for this new book, is to identify or divide all platforms into two types. One of the problems we have in platform research, and by the way, when we started researching platforms 25 years ago, Annabelle for her doctoral thesis, my colleagues at MIT Sloan said, what is a platform? It really doesn't sound like a very promising topic. Now it is one of the most exciting topics in research in management and strategy and innovation, as well as economics. And a lot of platform researchers will talk about different types of platforms. They'll talk about the lower level operating systems or microprocessors, or social media, or publishing portals, or aggregators of different types, and some have quite long lists. So we've looked at all of those and said, well, in fact, we have really two main types, at least in terms of their function. So the one type we call innovation platforms, and that was what Annabelle Gower and I originally wrote about in 2001. Also, it was what the story that I wrote in Microsoft Secrets 1995. It's taking an operating system with some other elements like a personal computer and using that as a foundation, not only as a product that has standalone value, but as a foundation that other firms can use to build applications and services. So today we call those innovation platforms. And of course, Windows was there originally, but Google Android, all the smartphones, but other elements underneath it, like some of the hardware, the CPUs from NVIDIA or Intel, of course, or a Sony PlayStation, WeChat APIs, for example, building applications on WeChat, Amazon Web Services, which is a new innovation platform for building applications in the Amazon development environment. Now, the other type of platform, which has the same characteristics of bringing multiple sides together, creating unique value from network effects, and the chicken or egg dilemma, we call transaction platforms. And these are any foundation that's bringing together two or more sides in order to exchange information or make it possible to buy and sell goods or access different services. So this includes everything from the Amazon marketplace, which is distinct from the Amazon store, which is just an online store. But the marketplace brings together buyers and sellers. In the store case, Amazon just buys and resells like Walmart does or El Corte Inglés does if you're looking at a department store. So bringing together buyers and sellers or people who want to communicate with other people and who want to be communicated to by advertisers, those all happen in transaction platforms. Also financial transactions like fintech. So we have many in this transaction platforms case. And then the wealthiest companies in the world are really hybrids. They're doing one or the other, or started with one or the other, but combine them in some way. Like have an innovation platform like iOS or an iPhone, and then have an app store, for example, to distribute applications. So it's become quite popular for every innovation platform to create some kind of a transaction platform mechanism or marketplace to distribute their innovations. Now, of course, I'm talking mostly about software, which is my experience, although I began my career in the automobile industry. So the automobile is in many ways becoming an innovation platform for many different types of suppliers, but not just suppliers under contract, but complementers to join in these different networks. So we'll get to that a little bit later. Okay, so one of the things that we did in this book is to try to identify the performance of these firms. And one of the problems I'm sure you're aware of is that many of these platforms are quite spectacular when they go public, but often they're spectacular as well for the billions of dollars that they lose. So we wanted to make sure first that we could identify at least publicly listed platforms that had business models that were making money. So this is a longer story, but I will just give you some of the highlights. So we began by looking at the top 2,000 global publicly listed firms. This was a Forbes Global 2000 list. We were only looking for digital platforms in the areas of using personal computers, internet services, or mobile devices as the basis of their platforms. So there were only 43 firms in that that met those conditions, and also they had to have 20% of their business generated from a network effect business. So it was a small sample of firms. We also created a control sample of product or service companies in exactly the same set of industries. And then we did some data analysis, and it was quite stunning. The control sample and the original sample of 43 platform companies, they each were large firms, about $4.5 billion in annual sales. So there is some survivor bias in this effect here. You need to get to be a large, relatively successful company even to get on our list. But given that, comparing two sets of successful companies with different fundamental business models, what do we see? The platform companies had roughly half the number of employees, twice the sales growth rates of the non-platform companies, almost twice the operating profits, and about 3 times the market values. So of course, market values were connected to growth rates and profits, but what was interesting is also the low number of employees. So these are very, let's say, asset-light types of businesses where they're leveraging engineering skills from outside the company, or they're marketplaces linking together buyers and sellers, or an Airbnb type of model linking, again, people that are looking for an asset with people that want to get access to that asset, but without owning the assets or owning the infrastructure around them. So it is a very efficient model if you do it successfully. I'm not going to go into all the data, but we also looked for failed companies that had tried to compete with these 43. We found 209 of those companies. So the success rate was about 17% for this set of platform companies, which is not bad, but it's part of the message that it's not so easy to become a multi-billion-dollar global successful platform company, but it is possible. Now, of course, we explain more of the detail in our book and some other papers. But the basic argument that we can say with pretty good confidence is that if you're a product company and you believe that you can enhance your product by opening up some pieces of it to third-party companies to enhance it in some way, then you should try what we call an innovation platform strategy. Okay? And again, this can occur in many different settings. And if you're in essentially a service business, if you believe that you can generate more value or additional value by connecting market participants rather than just continually creating goods or services yourself, then try a transaction platform. So the example here would be, let's say, in the hotel business. So if you believe that you can create some additional value by an Airbnb type of strategy, setting up a marketplace along with the hotels you either own or operate to make it possible for people to share, then try it, right? And that is what you now see hotels doing. In the innovation platform sense, the question for a company like Apple was, can we build the 2 million or so applications that will run on an iPhone? Or should we just open up the core of the iPhone operating system and features to allow an industry platform to emerge? And that was the decision they made. And by the way, Apple did not take that decision when it came to the Macintosh, which I'll explain in a moment. So the point here, though, too, is if you're in a market where entrepreneurs are starting to introduce these platform solutions, the market becomes platformized, then you're competing among platforms, which is the best or the better platform, not necessarily which is the better product. And the best platform really should win. And good platforms are open, modular, and they encourage the development of large ecosystems. So by the way, I say this here in a casual way, but it's a very personal story for me because I was using computers from the very early days. I learned how to use an IBM 370 computer with punch cards when I was in college. When the personal computer came out, it was like a miracle. It still is a miracle in many ways how it works. But I was very struck by the fact that Apple created essentially a much better product with the Apple Macintosh that came out in 1994 with a graphical user interface. It was wonderful, easy to use. But I had been using an IBM personal or IBM compatible personal computer. It came out in 1981 using the DOS character-based system. Kind of resembles the older IBM operating systems, character-based, no pictographs. Young people don't understand any of this description. But in any case, the Macintosh was a much better product, but it failed. It never really got more than 1 or 2% of the market before the iPhone was introduced in the 2000s, and that pulled up sales. So a clunky, hard-to-use personal computer that was cheap and powerful and a much better platform for building applications dominated the PC industry. So that's why we have a winner-take-most situation in PCs. That was Microsoft. A few years before that, and some of the academics know, I wrote another piece on why this was 1992, why the Sony Betamax video recorder, which was a better device in many ways than the VHS device created by Japan Victor and Panasonic, why the Betamax failed to be a global standard. And eventually, to see a Betamax today, you need to go to a museum. It's disappeared. We will see Macintoshes today because they've survived as a second platform. But in the case of VHS, it was the availability of pre-recorded tapes. And there was a network effect around the more companies producing pre-recorded tapes for VHS, the more people bought VHS, but VHS owners fueled that market. They did it very deliberately with relationships with movie producers, et cetera. So this is something you can actually manage, and I've understood this for quite a long time and saw the same phenomenon in many other platform or cases that became platforms. The other element in our book is really to take entrepreneurs through this thinking of how do you even envision what a platform would be. The first step is, who are you trying to bring together and for what purpose? Is it to enhance innovation around your core product, or is it to really create some kind of a marketplace, either a marketplace for ideas or communication system, or buying and selling or renting, or combining the two? So we go through these steps, choose your sides, figure out how you solve that chicken or egg problem. We have several different solutions. The third is the business model. How are you going to make money? And fourth is you need a set of rules to govern your ecosystem. And this also gets us into government role as well, as many of these platforms have become quite difficult to manage. It's not always clear which side comes first, and many great entrepreneurs, including Steve Jobs, for example, got it wrong. So we've written about that. Yellow Pages was one of the first cases that we write about, which came out in 1880, run by AT&T. It's how do you get people to put advertisements in a book when no one has a telephone? Right? It's two sides of bringing together buyers and sellers. Of course, you eventually create a list of everyone with a telephone, and then you promise to give away that book to everyone with a telephone, and then you can say to advertisers, everyone with a telephone will have the name of your company in a book in their house. And so you give away the Yellow Pages for free, and then you charge the advertisers. This was 1880 business model, which we still look at it with amazement today. But in many cases, we've had these dynamics. I once tried to find the first person who bought a fax machine. And I had a hypothesis that was driven by network effects. I believe that person had to have purchased 2 machines. Okay. I need not say anymore. Okay, but we have these kinds of problems all the time in the platform world. Microsoft Windows was very complicated, and Bill Gates had to put together a number of different partners or sides of the market before it could work. Notice that I have users last year. He believed that users were the last thing he had to worry about. The most important thing he had to worry about was certainly getting the basic technology together, but then building applications. And Bill Gates in 1981 concluded that computer demand would be driven by availability of applications. So what did he do? He created a software development kit for DOS and gave it away to application developers and said, build applications, and we will build some too, but you build. And by the time I wrote Microsoft Secrets in 1995, there were 5 million applications available for Windows. And of course, some of them had been written for DOS. So users were least important. Steve Jobs got it wrong. He actually thought the device was most important. So he built the device and bundled a few applications by paying Microsoft to write a few, but he had no applications ecosystem. So the Macintosh never took off, and it was very expensive. He'd never licensed the software or the hardware design. In the case of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg got it right. I can ask you the question, what do you think is the most important side? It's users, okay. And of course he got that right. So even going back to the lesson of Bill Gates, the most important side should be free, should be able to access the platform for free. That's why Bill Gates gave away the SDK for the DOS and then the Windows platforms, whereas Steve Jobs charged about the equivalent of about $10,000 to write applications for the Macintosh. So very few companies joined him at that point. Facebook as well, Mark Zuckerberg could have viewed this as a social media platform, like in the real world, a social club where you charged admission, but he charged no admission. He made it free. And even within the first year, he planned to charge advertisers. But he did other things. He opened up another side, opened up the programming interfaces for application developers. And application developers wrote eventually millions of applications or linked to millions of websites, about 10 million when we looked a few years ago. And of course, they keep users on the website and generate more information, which they sell to advertisers. All of that comes through the platform. Same thing with digital partners. The whole purpose is to keep users on the platform, generate more and more information on users, and essentially sell that to advertisers. I don't think Mark Zuckerberg had the purpose of manipulating American presidential elections or allowing the Russians to manipulate American public opinion. But that's also what happened. So that's the dark side of what can happen with these platforms if there are not proper governance mechanisms in place. So that does become a problem. And as I say, we wrote a chapter on this, and there's multiple elements involved in that. Not really going to spend time today because we're looking at frontiers of innovation and what's coming next. But whenever you have something new, you will have a kind of Wild West environment. And so companies and governments and individuals at some level need to pay attention to what we're doing and why we're doing it. So first, in the types of platforms that are generating these enormous amounts of very personal information, user data and security and illicit usage of that has become a huge problem, and you're all familiar with what has happened there. So that is very specific to the transaction platforms dealing with social media and advertising, but we've had earlier problems with platforms becoming far too powerful and controlling competition or prices in some ways, the antitrust actions that have come about. But one of the issues in digital platforms of this type is that in many cases, the product or the service that is the subject of the monopolistic behavior is given away for free. So Microsoft got ensnared in an antitrust trial for giving away a browser, for example, that was bundled with the operating system, but they crushed competition from Netscape in illegal ways, didn't need to do it. But problems like that continue. Google Android is free, for example, right? But yet it is the free good that is creating problems and destroying business models of other companies that are trying to compete fairly. So it's antitrust actions are very complicated in the digital world, and we don't usually have the experts in government that understand these things. And even in academics. So we are working closely with various government entities to try to get a handle on this. And also, companies need to regulate themselves in some ways. And historically, we're looking at how that happens. So we give some discussion of that in our book. Another issue is local regulations. You know, for example, Uber has for many years said it's not a taxi company. It shouldn't have to pay the insurance or wages that normal employers pay. But Uber has become kind of a taxi company or replacing taxis, or Airbnb has said it's not a hotel. It shouldn't have to pay the taxes or licensing and insurance fees that hotels pay. But now we've realized that they are in that business. They're not just software applications that sit on a smartphone. So now they are being forced to compete more on an even field. But early on, these digital platforms, including Amazon, which did not pay local state taxes for retail in the United States, internet firms were not required to do that, and that law has changed. So one of the great advantages of the digital platforms early on is that regulations were behind what the companies were actually doing. Facebook has always said it's not a publisher, but it kind of looks like a publisher. And there's also a law in the United States that says a digital platform is not responsible for the content that it disseminates. The creator of the content only is responsible. But these companies are making billions and billions of dollars off of this content that they're disseminating, and often in ways that are very harmful, right? Misinformation on health or manipulating elections. Okay. We also have labor and gig economy issues. Who's an employee? Who's an independent contractor? And there's a cost impact of that. So as I showed before, the digital platforms are more efficient than conventional companies competing in the same sectors. Part of that is the regulatory environment and other issues with labor. So the playing field might be leveled out someday. Another problem that we write about in the book is a term we coined in our first chapter. We call it platform mania. And this is a phrase, I wrote a specific article with this title, but platformizing a bad business does not make it a good business. And then I'm not quite sure what happened in the minds of investors like Masayoshi Son in Japan to think that, okay, if you have set up a transaction platform linking pet owners with people who want to walk their pets or walk their dogs for them, that you can create a multi-billion-dollar business. Well, if you do enough of it, you can create maybe a couple $1 billion in revenues, but you're also going to lose several $1 billion. So it's become a license to lose billions of dollars. And so you still have to have a fundamentally good business, but many people misunderstood that if you create a digital platform, it's like entering the world of digital businesses. But really it's not. If the fundamental product or service is a physical product that requires people in the physical world or warehousing or such, it's not like selling a digital good, which Microsoft has done or which Facebook does, right? Or which Google does. So platforms, like any other business, they really need to be a real business with a valuable product or service. But in particular, platforms or industry platforms, as I said, they really need to solve a market problem where some two parts of a market, buyers find it difficult to find sellers, or renters find it difficult to find people with assets. So it's some kind of a market failure that is really important for platforms to be successful. And they can benefit from some digital technology to achieve new scale and scope economies, but they need to be solving a problem. And if all they're doing is subsidizing market sides, like making one side free or giving something away at a lower price, it's not solved the chicken or egg problem. It's not growing through network effects. The bigger the platform gets, the more money it's likely to lose, is the basic message. And we can see this in Uber, for example. It needs lots of drivers. Of course, it needs riders. You can have drivers, but there's really not enough of them to pull in riders. And so what you have is a system of subsidies for both riders and drivers. So drivers are paid even when they're not driving, and riders are given a whole series of discounts. And you've probably seen these types of discount coupons for rides or free meals. And it's just a great way to lose a lot of investors' money. It's just been a massive transfer of wealth from several investors into the pockets of riders and drivers. So it's a wonderful thing as long as it keeps going on. I use Uber all the time. It's a wonderful service. Okay, but it's a terrible investment. Well, except for investors, because it's like a pyramid scheme. Eventually, it will collapse like the Chinese bike-sharing platforms have collapsed. These are cases of companies buying bikes and renting them out, thinking that there's some kind of a network effect here, like a club system. People will use it, and the more people who use it, the more bikes there are, the more people who use it. But there really is no network effect. It's just renting an asset at a cost below what the asset is really worth, WeWork is another case. They thought there would be some kind of network effects around different services around these mobile offices, but there really are none. Akaji is a Japanese or Chinese character for red ink, essentially, losing money. And so they're really not platforms. They're really maybe one-sided platforms in some way, but the company owns the asset and then is renting it out. In the case of bike sharing or WeWork, they're not multi-sided platforms. There's generating no network effects. It's really like a standalone product or service, but priced below cost. It's a great way to lose lots of, hopefully, other people's money, which is very different from Airbnb, which is set up in a way where it should always make money. It may lose money from competition or advertising, but it's really just bringing together underutilized assets with people that want access to those assets. So that's a wonderful type of transaction platform. It doesn't need any subsidies. Okay, so very quickly, some business advice here. First point, start with a good product or service or a core technology. Target some kind of an industry-wide problem or demand-supply imbalance, what we'll call a market failure. Build a platform around that, and of course an ecosystem that brings some of these parties that have difficulty finding each other together. You will need to subsidize the most important side, which means make access free for users or complementers, at least temporarily, to solve that chicken or egg problem. But eventually, after the launch phase, you need to be able to get into a mode where you're growing through network effects, one side pulling the other and vice versa, not just growing through subsidies or below cost prices. That's a recipe for disaster. So quickly, and I know we're running a bit out of time, but we have many new platforms coming down the pike, and all of them will be challenged in terms of business models and subsidies and regulations. And so let me just talk quickly about a few that we profiled in our book. We also make some predictions that we are seeing more combination of innovation and transaction platforms. So these business models are becoming more and more complicated. Second, they're becoming bigger, more industry concentration, pushing out smaller players. And third, a lot of new platforms are coming from new technologies, new enabling technologies that are appearing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain. Those are not platforms in and of themselves, but they enable new platforms, biotech and quantum computing. So we've written about several of these in the book, and I'll just give a quick overview of how we think about it. So self-driving cars is pretty exciting. They bring together a lot of technologies I've been interested in for many years. Artificial intelligence and machine learning and data is at the core. But the problem that can be addressed by some platform solutions is that the data needs to come together with various devices, cameras, lasers, radar, sonar. So we need to be able to integrate the data. It's not clear that any one company has all the solutions. So we see companies coming together, combining their solutions. Mostly they're combining them in groups. We have some go-it-alone companies like Tesla. But we definitely have group-level platforms that are emerging. They're not across a whole industry, but they are around some groups that are sharing technologies. We have some horizontal suppliers like Intel Mobileye, which has a camera system, but it's combined with a software system that integrates data from multiple sources. You need cameras to read, say, a traffic sign, right? Stop. A laser or sonar can't do that. So you have to have a camera, but cameras are not good in bad weather, so you need other solutions. And all of the big tech players, Microsoft, IBM, et cetera, are in this place. So there's an innovation platform opportunity for third parties to complement some of those core technologies from, say, NVIDIA or Intel Mobileye, and also transaction platforms around some of the sharing services that could be enabled by these self-driving technologies, like robo-taxis is one, but also charging sharing systems. So self-driving vehicles will go along with electrical vehicles because just the infrastructure makes it easier to do that. This is one prediction. By 2023, they'll be pretty much equivalent. 2025, We may actually see cheaper electric cars with the same range or greater range than automobiles powered by gasoline or diesel. But it's happening. And what we see is a very broad set of players around building the subsystems for driving, a lot of companies competing in data and simulating the behavior of these systems, all the different sensors, another set of component manufacturers, actual vehicle manufacturers, all different services, location-based services, mobility infrastructure, sharing economy, communication services. Vehicles will someday communicate with each other like airplanes communicate with each other, but we'll need some connections to the ground as well. Maybe stop signs or traffic lights become smart as well, communicating with individual vehicles. So this is a perfect environment for platform thinking to get more and more companies sharing what they're doing for reasons of safety as well as efficacy in the technology. So BMW and Daimler are one group, Volkswagen, Waymo and Uber was involved. This is another group. There's a lot of the major automakers and all the key horizontal suppliers. Intel is in the middle of this, sharing its IQ chips from Mobileye, which was an Israeli startup, and they're in about 60% of all of these different car systems. And Waymo is also involved as well. And both of them are building car sharing types or robo-taxi or automated driver system sharing platform as well, at least for specific pre-designated routes. Okay, and there's a bunch of other companies participating through data, charging networks, mapping systems, autonomous fleets, and a lot of opportunities for discrete development of technologies. So these are great opportunities for startups as well as the bigger companies. Most of these here are startup companies. Okay, so that's one, and I know it's hard to go through all of the different examples, but let me take the time. Biotechnology, gene editing are also another area we've been looking at. Now, these are specific technologies, but there's so many different pieces to this, and the value chains are so long that some kind of a sharing mechanism or marketplace for some critical services seems to be coming about. First, for the innovation platforms, where companies don't need to reinvent everything that they're doing. Some of the mRNA or even the coronavirus itself is a kind of a platform for creating multiple diseases. So on the other side, we can create different types of diagnostic tests or vaccines. So this is how we're thinking about genetic or pieces of genetic material. Transaction platforms may also make it possible to share different services for clinical trials or regulation or even production, for example. Just like we have fabs for semiconductors, we can actually have fabs for mass producing vaccines. So the world is probably going to need something like that. So CRISPR is a simple cut and paste technology. We have CRISPR startups all around the world, again, heavily in the US, several in Europe as well. mRNA, the operating system of Moderna, which is an MIT spin-out, for example. They're talking about their platform enabling different drug discovery. And so it's an exciting world in biotech. And so finally, let me just say a few words about quantum computers. So it is a new computing platform. I've been following it for at least 15 years and also teaching it in my class. So quantum computers are these strange devices that basically take advantage of the behavior of atoms or molecules at the quantum level and use them either as circuits or essentially analog computers simulating different phenomena that we can actually program into the molecules using microwaves for the most part. So there's a lot of opportunity for innovation platforms, new types of optimization and simulation, and also for transaction platforms for secure communications. So there's many different big companies involved in both of these different approaches and a lot of startup companies. This is one of the most hot areas right now in actually investing. China has already demonstrated quantum communications, and the thing with quantum communications, it's a little bit complicated to explain, but cryptography is a very important area for quantum computing. Modeling the behavior of molecules or proteins, machine learning, searching through enormous data sets. We have a whole ecosystem of companies emerging in these areas. Companies are actually selling devices. We have two different types of computers, an analog type and something that looks more like a digital computer with a circuit gate model. And we have competition going on with China leading the way in patents, but the United States leading the way in actually building devices, and big companies and startups. So that is really where we are. But the bottom line here is that these computers will be doing useful work in fintech and cryptography within the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. And so it is definitely something to take note of. Okay, so my final point. These new enabling technologies, they really level the playing field between big companies and startups. They can also fill a lot of gaps, but solve a lot of the world's problems that are very important. Global warming, energy optimization, mobility, modeling for disease and pandemics, high-performance computing and cryptography, secure communications. So these are all big problems, and we have unique opportunities to address these problems, but it does require a level of cooperation and even platform thinking amongst universities, governments, and corporations, and some type of cooperation also from, of course, entrepreneurs who need to step up and take on these challenges. Okay, so that is my message for today, and hopefully we can continue the discussion in the panel discussions. All right? Thank you.